Sarah Martinez pulled her thick winter coat tighter around her shoulders as she walked through the corridors of Riverside General Hospital. The fabric bunched awkwardly over her left side, creating an odd bulge that drew curious glances from passing colleagues. At 28, she had worked as a trauma nurse for 3 years, but lately, those same colleagues had begun whispering behind her back. "There goes Sarah with her mystery illness again," she overheard Dr. Peterson mutter to another physician near the nurse's station. "Always complaining about something we can't see." The words stung more than Sarah cared to admit. For the past 6 months, she had been struggling with what appeared to be unexplained fatigue, occasional tremors in her left hand, and a persistent ache along her left shoulder blade. Multiple doctor visits had yielded nothing conclusive. Blood tests came back normal. X-rays showed nothing unusual. Even the expensive MRI her insurance barely covered revealed no obvious cause for her symptoms. Stress, most doctors concluded. You work in a high-pressure environment. Maybe consider therapy or a vacation. But Sarah knew her body. She had completed 2 tours as a combat medic with the Army before transitioning to civilian nursing. She understood the difference between exhaustion and something deeper, something wrong. The tremors weren't from caffeine or nerves. The shoulder pain wasn't from poor posture during long shifts. Something was happening to her body that no one seemed willing or able to diagnose. Her supervisor, Janet Williams, called her into the office on a gray Tuesday morning in November. Janet was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had run the emergency department for over a decade. She believed in accountability, performance metrics, and getting results. "Sarah, we need to talk," Janet said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "I've been reviewing your attendance records and performance evaluations." Sarah sat down carefully, conscious of how her coat pulled across her shoulders. She had learned to move slowly, deliberately, to minimize the visible effects of whatever was wrong with her. "Your sick days have increased significantly over the past year," Janet continued, flipping through a manila folder. 14 days in the last 6 months alone. "And several nurses have mentioned that you seem distracted during shifts. Not as sharp as you used to be." "I've been dealing with some health issues," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady. "I'm working with doctors to figure out what's going on." Janet's expression softened slightly, but her tone remained professional. "Sarah, I respect your military service, and you've been a valuable member of our team. But we can't have nurses who aren't operating at full capacity. Patient safety is our top priority." "I understand that, but I'm not putting patients at risk," Sarah said. "My clinical skills are intact. I'm just dealing with some physical symptoms that doctors are still investigating." "Physical symptoms that no one can find a cause for," Janet pointed out. "Look, I'm not saying you're making things up, but we've all seen healthcare workers develop psychosomatic issues. The stress of this job, especially combined with your military background, maybe you should consider whether you're dealing with some unresolved trauma." The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah had heard variations of this suggestion from multiple sources over the past months. Friends, family members, and now her supervisor all seemed convinced that her problems were psychological rather than physical. The assumption that her military service had somehow broken her mentally felt like a betrayal of everything she had accomplished. "I appreciate your concern," Sarah said carefully, "but I know the difference between PTSD and physical illness. I've been through extensive psychological evaluation as part of my military service. This is something else." Janet closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. "I'm going to be direct with you, Sarah. We can't continue to accommodate unlimited sick days and reduce performance indefinitely. I need you to either get a clear medical diagnosis that explains your limitations, or I need you to consider whether this job is still the right fit for you." The ultimatum felt like a punch to the stomach. Sarah had dedicated her career to helping others, first in combat zones and now in civilian emergency medicine. The idea of losing her position because of an illness no one believed was real seemed profoundly unfair. "How much time do I have?" Sarah asked. "Let's say 60 days, Janet replied. Give me documentation from a specialist that explains your condition and any necessary accommodations, or we'll need to discuss alternative arrangements. Sarah left the meeting feeling more isolated than ever. As she walked back to the nurse's station, she caught fragments of conversation from her colleagues. Did you see how she was moving? Like she's in pain, but the doctors can't find anything wrong. My cousin had something similar. Turned out to be fibromyalgia. Basically means you hurt everywhere, but there's no real cause. I heard she's been to 5 different doctors. At some point, you have to wonder if it's all in her head. The speculation and judgment from people she had considered friends and allies created a constant undercurrent of stress in her daily work life. Sarah found herself second-guessing every movement, every decision, wondering if others were watching for signs of weakness or incompetence. During her lunch break, Sarah sat in her car and called her older brother, Miguel, who lived across the country in Colorado. Miguel had served in the Marines and was one of the few people who understood her military background without treating her like a fragile victim. They think I'm making it up, Sarah told him, trying to keep the frustration out of her voice. Or that it's psychological, like I can't handle the stress of civilian life. That's garbage, Miguel replied immediately. You're one of the toughest people I know. You saved lives in Afghanistan while under enemy fire. You don't develop mystery illnesses because of workplace stress. But what if they're right? What if there really is nothing wrong, and I'm just losing my mind? Sarah, listen to me. You know your body better than anyone else. If you say something's wrong, something's wrong. Don't let them gaslight you into thinking otherwise. Miguel's support meant everything, but it didn't solve her immediate problem. Sarah still needed answers, and she was running out of time to find them. Her savings were depleting rapidly from medical expenses, and the stress of being constantly questioned and doubted was taking its own toll. That evening, Sarah researched her symptoms online for the 100th time, looking for any combination of factors that might explain what she was experiencing. The internet, predictably, offered everything from rare autoimmune disorders to various forms of cancer. Most medical websites warned against self-diagnosis and recommended consulting with healthcare professionals, which felt like cruel irony given her situation. She had already seen her primary care physician, 2 different specialists, and even sought a second opinion from a neurologist at a different hospital system. Each visit followed the same pattern: detailed history, physical examination, some form of testing, and ultimately a recommendation to see someone else or try a different approach. We want to rule out everything possible, was the common refrain, but ruling out possibilities wasn't the same as finding answers. The next morning, Sarah arrived at work early, hoping to avoid the usual crowd of colleagues who seemed to monitor her every movement. She had developed strategies for managing her symptoms during shifts, taking frequent breaks, asking for help with heavy lifting, and positioning herself near walls or equipment that could provide subtle support when the tremors became pronounced. Her first patient of the day was a construction worker who had fallen from scaffolding and sustained multiple injuries. As Sarah worked to establish floor access and monitor his vital signs, she felt a familiar ache spreading across her left shoulder blade. The tremor in her hand became more noticeable as she tried to document the patient's condition on the computer. Dr. Chun, one of the attending physicians, noticed her difficulty with the keyboard and stepped closer. "Everything okay, Sarah?" "Just a little tired," she replied, forcing her hand to steady. "Long night." Dr. Chun nodded, but continued watching her movements with concern. Sarah could see the wheels turning in his mind, probably wondering whether she was fit to handle critical patients. The scrutiny made her more nervous, which in turn made the tremors worse. During her break, Sarah retreated to the hospital chapel, a quiet space where she could sit without being observed or judged. The room was non-denominational, with simple wooden pews and soft lighting that provided a refuge from the harsh fluorescent environment of the hospital corridors. She wasn't particularly religious, but the silence and solitude offered a chance to think clearly about her situation. In 60 days, She needed to provide her supervisor with either a medical explanation for her condition or accept that her nursing career might be over. The prospect of losing the profession she loved because of an invisible, unnamed illness felt deeply unjust. As Sarah sat in the chapel, she thought about her military service and the wounded soldiers she had treated in field hospitals. Many of them had sustained injuries that weren't immediately visible to casual observers. Traumatic brain injuries, internal organ damage, psychological trauma that manifested in physical symptoms. She had never questioned the reality of their suffering, even when it couldn't be easily categorized or quantified. Yet here she was experiencing something similar and finding herself on the receiving end of doubt and skepticism from the very medical community she had dedicated her life to serving. The irony wasn't lost on her that as a combat medic, she had been trained to diagnose and treat injuries under the most challenging conditions imaginable. She had performed emergency medical procedures while under enemy fire, saved lives with limited resources, and earned commendations for her service. Now, she couldn't even convince civilian doctors that her own symptoms were real. That afternoon, Sarah's symptoms seemed particularly pronounced. The ache in her shoulder had intensified to a sharp, stabbing pain that made it difficult to concentrate on patient care. The tremor in her left hand became obvious enough that she had to switch to using primarily her right hand for procedures. During a particularly busy period in the emergency department, Sarah was assigned to assist with a trauma case involving a motorcycle accident victim. As she worked to help stabilize the patient, the pain in her shoulder suddenly spiked to an unbearable level. She gasped involuntarily and stepped back from the gurney. "Sarah, what's wrong?" asked Dr. Peterson, the same physician who had been questioning her credibility. "I'm sorry, I just need a moment," Sarah replied, trying to breathe through the pain. "Maybe you should go home," Dr. Peterson suggested, but his tone carried more irritation than concern. "We can't have nurses collapsing during critical procedures." The suggestion felt like another nail in the coffin of her professional reputation. Sarah wanted to explain that she wasn't collapsing, that she was managing a legitimate medical condition as best she could, but the words seemed inadequate in the face of such obvious skepticism. She finished her shift with difficulty, relying heavily on her colleagues to handle the more physically demanding aspects of patient care. By the time she left the hospital, Sarah felt emotionally and physically drained. The constant pain, combined with the stress of being constantly judged and questioned, was becoming unsustainable. That night, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if everyone else was right. Maybe she was imagining her symptoms. Maybe the stress of transitioning from military to civilian life had finally caught up with her. Maybe she was developing some form of psychological disorder that was manifesting in physical ways. But deep down, Sarah knew something was wrong with her body. The pain was real. The tremors were real. The fatigue that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than normal exhaustion was real. She just needed to find someone who could help her understand what was happening and why. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah made a mental promise to herself. She would continue fighting for answers, no matter how many doctors she had to see or how much skepticism she encountered. Her military training had taught her never to give up, especially when the stakes were high. Her career, her health, and her sense of self-worth were all on the line. Tomorrow, she would start researching specialists outside her immediate area, doctors who might have experience with unusual or difficult-to-diagnose conditions. She would not let the doubt and judgment of others determine her fate. Somewhere, there was an answer to what was happening to her body, and she would find it. The battle for her professional life was just beginning, and Sarah Martinez had never been one to surrender without a fight. 3 weeks into Sarah's 60-day deadline, she found herself in the waiting room of Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a neurologist who specialized in unusual movement disorders and unexplained neurological symptoms. The appointment had taken 6 weeks to secure, and Sarah had driven 4 hours to reach the medical center in the state capital. Dr. Rodriguez had an impressive reputation for taking on difficult cases that other physicians had given up on. Her office walls were covered with thank you letters from patients who had struggled for years to find answers. Sarah felt a cautious optimism as she filled out the extensive intake forms that asked detailed questions about her symptoms, their progression, and their impact on her daily life. When Dr. Rodriguez finally called her in, Sarah was struck by the physician's direct but compassionate demeanor. Unlike previous doctors who had seemed rushed or dismissive, Dr. Rodriguez took time to really listen to Sarah's description of her symptoms. "Tell me about your military service, Dr." Rodriguez said, settling into her chair with a notepad. "What was your role, and where did you serve?" Sarah had grown weary of this question, as it usually led to assumptions about PTSD or psychological trauma. But something in Dr. Rodriguez's tone suggested genuine medical curiosity rather than prejudgment. "I was a combat medic with the Army," Sarah explained. "2 tours in Afghanistan, primarily stationed at forward operating bases providing emergency medical care to wounded soldiers." "Any injuries during your service?" "Minor stuff, some cuts and bruises from rocket attacks. Nothing that required serious medical attention at the time." Dr. Rodriguez made notes and then conducted the most thorough neurological examination Sarah had ever experienced. She tested reflexes, coordination, strength, and sensation with methodical precision. When she examined Sarah's left shoulder area, she paused and asked Sarah to remove her coat. "How long have you been wearing this heavy coat indoors?" Dr. Rodriguez asked. "A few months," Sarah admitted. "It helps support my shoulder, and it covers up the visible tremors. May I examine your shoulder and back area more closely?" Sarah nodded and carefully removed her coat. She was wearing a sleeveless blouse that exposed her upper back and shoulders. Dr. Rodriguez used her fingers to palpate along Sarah's spine and shoulder blade, pressing gently but systematically. Suddenly, Dr. Rodriguez stopped. Her fingers had found something along Sarah's left shoulder blade, and her expression changed from routine examination to focused concern. "Sarah, I'm feeling some scar tissue here that seems much more significant than you described. Can you tell me exactly what happened to cause this?" Sarah was confused. "I don't remember any specific injury to that area. Like I said, just minor cuts and bruises during rocket attacks." Dr. Rodriguez used a magnifying light to examine the area more closely. "There's definitely scarring here, and it appears to extend deeper than surface level. The pattern suggests some kind of penetrating trauma. Are you sure you don't remember being injured in this area?" "I mean, there were several times we took incoming fire and had to take cover quickly. Lots of chaos, lots of adrenaline. It's possible I got hurt and didn't realize it at the time." Dr. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "Combat situations can definitely mask injuries, especially when survival instincts take over. I think we need to get some imaging studies of this area. Not just x-rays, but a detailed CT scan and possibly an MRI with contrast." For the first time in months, Sarah felt like a doctor was taking her seriously. Dr. Rodriguez wasn't dismissing her symptoms or suggesting they were psychological. She was investigating the physical evidence her own hands had discovered. "What do you think it could be?" Sarah asked. "It's too early to say definitively, but the location of your symptoms corresponds exactly to where I'm feeling this scar tissue. If there's a foreign object or some kind of embedded material in that area, it could explain the pain, the tremors, and the other neurological symptoms you've been experiencing." Sarah left the appointment with orders for multiple imaging studies and instructions to return in 2 weeks. For the first time in months, she felt hopeful that someone might finally have answers for her condition. The drive back to her hometown gave Sarah time to think about her military service in a way she hadn't for years. She remembered specific incidents where she had been in danger, times when rocket attacks or mortar fire had forced her to dive for cover or throw herself between incoming fire and wounded soldiers she was treating. One incident in particular stood out in her memory. She had been treating a wounded soldier in a forward aid station when the base came under attack. Explosions had rocked the area, and she remembered feeling something strike her back as she shielded her patient from debris. At the time, With adrenaline coursing through her system and the urgent need to save lives, she had ignored whatever had hit her and continued working. The combat environment had a way of making people push through injuries that would normally demand immediate attention. Sarah recalled seeing soldiers continue fighting with wounds that should have been incapacitating. The combination of adrenaline, training, and life-or-death circumstances created a mental state where pain and injury became secondary to mission completion. When Sarah returned to work the next day, she felt lighter despite still experiencing her symptoms. Having a doctor who believed her and was actively investigating her condition made an enormous difference in her mental state. She was able to focus better on her patients and felt less defensive about her physical limitations. Janet Williams noticed the change immediately. "You seem different today," she observed during their brief interaction at the nurse's station. "More like your old self. I think I finally found a doctor who takes my symptoms seriously," Sarah explained. "I'm getting some additional testing done that might provide answers." Janet nodded approvingly. "That's good to hear. We all want you to get better and return to full capacity." The imaging studies were scheduled for the following week at the medical center where Dr. Rodriguez practiced. Sarah took vacation days to make the trip, not wanting to call in sick again, and add to her supervisor's concerns about her reliability. The CT scan and MRI procedures took most of the day. The technicians were professional, but didn't provide any immediate information about their findings. Sarah would have to wait for Dr. Rodriguez to review the results and call with her interpretation. The waiting period was agonizing. Sarah found herself mentally preparing for both possibilities: that the scans would show something significant that explained her symptoms, or that they would come back normal like all her previous tests, leaving her back where she started. 3 days later, Dr. Rodriguez called personally rather than having a nurse relay the results. "Sarah, I need you to come back to see me as soon as possible," Dr. Rodriguez said. "The imaging studies show something significant that we need to discuss in person. Can you tell me anything over the phone? I prefer to go over the images with you directly, but I can tell you that we found what appears to be a metallic fragment embedded near your left shoulder blade. It's been there for some time, and its position corresponds exactly with the symptoms you've been experiencing." Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and concern. Finally, there was physical evidence for her condition, proof that she hadn't been imagining or exaggerating her symptoms. But the presence of a foreign object in her body raised new questions about what it was and how it had gotten there. "Is it dangerous?" Sarah asked. "We'll discuss all the details when you come in, but the important thing is that we now have an explanation for your symptoms and can develop a treatment plan." Sarah immediately requested time off work and made an appointment to see Dr. Rodriguez 2 days later. This time, she asked Miguel to drive down from Colorado to accompany her to the appointment. Having family support felt important as she prepared to learn more about her condition. Miguel arrived the night before the appointment, and Sarah filled him in on everything that had happened since their last conversation. Her brother was characteristically direct in his response. "I knew there was something real going on," he said. "You don't develop mysterious neurological symptoms from stress. Military people are trained to handle stress." "The hard part is that I don't even remember getting injured," Sarah replied. "How do you miss having a piece of metal lodged in your body?" "Combat does weird things to your perception," Miguel explained. "I've seen guys take shrapnel and keep fighting for hours before realizing they were hurt. The adrenaline and focus required to stay alive can mask a lot of pain." The next morning, Sarah and Miguel met with Dr. Rodriguez, who had prepared a detailed presentation of the imaging results. The CT scan clearly showed a metallic fragment approximately 2 centimeters long embedded in the muscle tissue near Sarah's left shoulder blade. Its position was close to several nerve pathways, which explained the neurological symptoms she had been experiencing. Based on the density and shape of the fragment, it appears to be shrapnel, probably from an explosive device, Dr. Rodriguez explained. "It's been in your body for several years, and over time, scar tissue has formed around it. Recently, it seems to have shifted slightly, which is why your symptoms have become more pronounced." Sarah stared at the images on the computer screen, seeing clear evidence of the injury she had unknowingly carried for years. Why didn't it show up on previous X-rays? The angle and location made it difficult to detect without the specific imaging protocols we used, Dr. Rodriguez replied. Also, if previous doctors weren't specifically looking for foreign objects or weren't aware of your combat exposure, they might not have ordered the right studies. Miguel leaned forward in his chair. What's the treatment plan? The fragment needs to be removed surgically, Dr. Rodriguez said. It's close to some important nerve pathways, so it will require a careful approach, but it's definitely doable. Once we remove it and address the scar tissue, Sarah's symptoms should improve significantly. Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over her. Not only did she have a definitive diagnosis, but there was a clear path forward for treatment. The months of being questioned, doubted, and dismissed suddenly seemed like a distant nightmare. When can we schedule the surgery? Sarah asked. I'd like to do it within the next few weeks. We'll need to coordinate with a specialist who has experience with this type of procedure, but I don't anticipate any significant delays. As they left the medical center, Sarah felt like a different person than the one who had arrived months earlier desperate for answers. She had proof that her symptoms were real, a clear explanation for their cause, and a treatment plan that would restore her health and her career. The drive home gave her time to process everything that had happened. She thought about all the colleagues who had questioned her condition, the supervisors who had suggested her problems were psychological, and the doctors who had dismissed her symptoms as stress-related. Part of her felt angry at the system that had failed her so completely. A combat veteran with an undiagnosed war injury had been treated as if she were malingering or psychologically unstable. The irony was bitter. She had risked her life to save others in combat, sustained an injury while doing so, and then been treated as if her resulting symptoms were somehow her fault. But another part of her felt grateful to have finally found the answers she needed. Dr. Rodriguez had demonstrated what good medical care looked like: thorough examination, careful listening, and persistence in investigating unusual symptoms rather than dismissing them. When Sarah returned to work the next day, she immediately scheduled a meeting with Janet Williams to update her on the diagnosis and treatment plan. She brought copies of the imaging studies and Dr. Rodriguez's report documenting the embedded shrapnel and its neurological effects. Janet's reaction was immediate and profound. Sarah, I owe you an apology. We all do. I can't believe you've been dealing with a combat injury this whole time while we questioned whether your symptoms were real. I didn't know either, Sarah replied. I had no memory of being injured. But the evidence is pretty clear. What do you need from us in terms of accommodation and support? I'll need some time off for surgery and recovery, but Dr. Rodriguez expects a full recovery once the fragment is removed. Janet nodded emphatically. Take whatever time you need. And, Sarah, I want you to know that your job will be waiting for you when you're ready to come back. We should have been more supportive during this process. As word spread through the hospital about Sarah's diagnosis, the atmosphere around her changed dramatically. Colleagues who had been whispering about her mysterious illness now approached her with apologies and expressions of support. The same symptoms that had been viewed with suspicion were now seen as evidence of her sacrifice and service. Dr. Peterson, who had been among the most skeptical of her colleagues, made a point of seeking her out during her lunch break. Sarah, I owe you a sincere apology, he said. I jumped to conclusions about your condition without giving you the benefit of the doubt. That was unprofessional and unfair. I understand why people were skeptical, Sarah replied. The symptoms seemed to come out of nowhere, and there was no obvious explanation. I started doubting myself too. That's exactly why we need to be more careful about dismissing patients' concerns, especially when we don't have clear answers. Your case is going to make me a better doctor. The conversation represented a broader shift in how Sarah was perceived by her colleagues. Instead of being seen as someone who couldn't handle the stress of her job, she was now viewed as a combat veteran who had been unknowingly dealing with a war injury, while continuing to serve patients with dedication and professionalism. That evening, Sarah called Miguel to update him on the positive changes at work and to thank him for his unwavering support throughout the ordeal. "I'm proud of you for not giving up," Miguel said. "A lot of people would have accepted the narrative that it was all in their head. You kept fighting for the truth." "I had to. I knew something was wrong, even when everyone else doubted it." "That's exactly the kind of persistence that made you a good combat medic. You didn't let other people's opinions override your own judgment and experience." As Sarah prepared for surgery in the coming weeks, she reflected on the lessons she had learned from her experience. The importance of advocating for oneself in medical settings, the danger of dismissing patients' concerns without thorough investigation, and the value of perseverance in the face of skepticism and doubt. Her story had become more than just a personal medical journey. It represented broader issues about how veterans are treated in civilian healthcare settings, how invisible injuries can be misunderstood or dismissed, and how important it is for medical professionals to maintain open minds when evaluating unusual symptoms. Most importantly, Sarah had learned to trust her own instincts and knowledge of her body. Despite months of being told that her symptoms were psychological or stress-related, she had maintained her conviction that something physical was wrong. That persistence had ultimately led to the correct diagnosis and appropriate treatment. The battle for recognition and proper medical care had been won, but Sarah knew that the larger war for understanding and support of veterans with invisible injuries was ongoing. Her experience had given her a new perspective on the challenges faced by military personnel transitioning to civilian life and the importance of comprehensive understanding healthcare. As she looked forward to surgery and recovery, Sarah felt optimistic not just about her own future, but about the possibility of using her experience to help other veterans who might be facing similar challenges. The fragment of shrapnel that had caused her so much pain and difficulty was about to be removed, but the strength and determination it had revealed in her character would remain forever. The surgery took place on a crisp Tuesday morning in March, exactly 11 months after Sarah's symptoms had first become noticeable. Miguel had taken time off work to be there, and even their parents had driven in from Texas to provide support during the procedure. Dr. Rodriguez worked alongside Dr. Michael Harrison, a thoracic surgeon who specialized in removing foreign objects from challenging anatomical locations. The procedure took nearly 3 hours, longer than initially anticipated due to the complex scar tissue that had formed around the shrapnel fragment over the years. When Sarah woke up in recovery, the first thing she noticed was the absence of the familiar ache in her left shoulder blade. The constant background pain that had become such a dominant part of her daily experience was simply gone. Her left hand, which had developed an increasingly noticeable tremor over recent months, lay steady and still on the hospital blanket. Dr. Rodriguez appeared at her bedside with a small metal container. Inside was the piece of shrapnel that had been removed from Sarah's body, a jagged fragment of steel approximately 2 centimeters long with sharp, irregular edges. Looking at it, Sarah was amazed that something so small could have caused such significant symptoms. "This little piece of metal has been pressing against a nerve cluster for years," Dr. Rodriguez explained. As the scar tissue around it changed and shifted, it gradually increased pressure on the surrounding nerves, which explains why your symptoms became more pronounced over time. "Is this definitely from my military service?" Sarah asked, still feeling groggy from the anesthesia. The composition and characteristics are consistent with explosive fragmentation typically seen in combat injuries. Based on the degree of tissue integration, I'd estimate it's been in your body for approximately 5 to 6 years. The timeline matched perfectly with Sarah's deployment to Afghanistan. The fragment had been her silent companion through her transition back to civilian life, her completion of nursing school, and her early career at Riverside General Hospital. It had influenced her daily life in ways she never could have imagined. Recovery progressed remarkably well. Within days, Sarah noticed improvements in her energy level and coordination that she hadn't even realized had been compromised. The tremor in her left hand disappeared completely. The chronic fatigue that had made long nursing shifts increasingly difficult began to lift like a fog clearing from her mind. 2 weeks after surgery, Sarah returned to work on a limited schedule to ease back into her normal routine. The difference in how her colleagues treated her was remarkable. Instead of the whispered conversations and skeptical glances she had grown accustomed to, she was greeted with genuine concern for her recovery and respect for what she had endured. Janet Williams called her into the office on her second day back, but this time the conversation was entirely different from their previous meetings. "Sarah, I want to formally apologize for how we handled your situation," Janet began. "As healthcare professionals, we should have been more supportive and understanding. Your experience has prompted us to review our policies for employees dealing with unexplained medical symptoms." "What kind of changes are you considering?" Sarah asked. "We're implementing new protocols for handling situations where employees report persistent symptoms that aren't immediately diagnosable. Instead of treating these cases with skepticism, we'll provide additional support and resources to help staff members find appropriate medical care." Sarah was pleased to hear about the policy changes, but she was more interested in returning to full capacity as a nurse than dwelling on past difficulties. The physical improvements she was experiencing made her eager to get back to the demanding but rewarding work of emergency medicine. Dr. Peterson approached her during a break on her third day back. "Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about your case since your surgery. It's made me realize how easy it is for medical professionals to develop blind spots when we can't quickly categorize or explain a patient's symptoms." "What do you mean?" "We're trained to look for common diagnoses and familiar patterns. When something doesn't fit those patterns, there's a tendency to assume the problem isn't real rather than acknowledging that our knowledge might be incomplete. Your case is going to change how I approach patients with unexplained symptoms." This conversation represented a broader shift in perspective that Sarah's experience had created among her colleagues. Her case had become a powerful reminder about the importance of taking patients seriously, even when their symptoms didn't fit standard diagnostic criteria. 1 month after surgery, Sarah attended a follow-up appointment with Dr. Rodriguez. The examination showed complete healing of the surgical site and resolution of all her previous neurological symptoms. For the first time in almost a year, Sarah received a clean bill of health from a medical professional. "How are you feeling about returning to full duties?" Dr. Rodriguez asked. "I feel better than I have in years," Sarah replied honestly. "Not just physically, but mentally. Having a diagnosis and successful treatment has given me back my confidence in my own judgment and abilities." That's an important point. Living with unexplained symptoms can be psychologically devastating, especially when those symptoms are questioned or dismissed by others. You showed remarkable resilience throughout this process. As spring turned to summer, Sarah found herself becoming an advocate for other veterans dealing with undiagnosed medical issues. She spoke at a local veterans organization meeting about her experience and the importance of persistent self-advocacy in medical settings. "The most important thing I learned," Sarah told the audience of fellow veterans, "is to trust your own knowledge of your body. Military training teaches us to push through pain and discomfort, which can be an asset in combat, but a liability when seeking medical care. Don't let anyone convince you that symptoms you're experiencing aren't real just because they can't immediately explain them." Her story resonated powerfully with the veterans in attendance. Several approached her after the presentation to share their own experiences with unexplained symptoms and difficulties getting appropriate medical care. Sarah realized that her experience was far from unique among military personnel transitioning to civilian life. This realization inspired Sarah to pursue additional training in veteran healthcare issues. She enrolled in a continuing education program focused on combat-related injuries and their long-term effects. The program covered topics like traumatic brain injury, PTSD, and the complex ways that combat stress and physical trauma could interact to create challenging diagnostic situations. During one particularly enlightening class session, Sarah learned about the phenomenon of embedded foreign objects in combat veterans. The instructor, a physician who had served in military hospitals overseas, explained that small pieces of shrapnel and other debris were far more common in returning service members than most civilian doctors realized. These fragments often don't show up on routine imaging studies, the instructor explained. They can remain asymptomatic for years before shifting position or causing inflammatory responses that produce symptoms. Many veterans live with undiagnosed foreign objects that affect their quality of life in subtle but significant ways. This information validated Sarah's experience and helped her understand that her case was part of a larger pattern affecting many veterans. She began to see her personal medical journey as connected to broader issues of veteran healthcare and the need for improved understanding of combat-related injuries among civilian medical providers. Sarah's newfound expertise and personal experience made her a valuable resource for other veterans navigating similar challenges. She began volunteering with a local veteran support organization, helping military personnel understand their healthcare options and advocating for comprehensive medical evaluations when standard approaches weren't providing answers. One particularly rewarding case involved helping a young Marine veteran named David who had been experiencing chronic headaches and memory problems since returning from deployment. Like Sarah, David had been told by multiple doctors that his symptoms were likely stress-related or psychological in nature. Drawing on her own experience, Sarah encouraged David to seek evaluation at a medical center that specialized in veteran health care. She helped him compile a detailed timeline of his symptoms and prepared questions to ask during medical appointments. Most importantly, she assured him that his symptoms were worth investigating thoroughly, regardless of what previous doctors had suggested. David's persistence, supported by Sarah's advocacy, eventually led to the discovery of a mild traumatic brain injury that had gone undiagnosed for over 2 years. With appropriate treatment and rehabilitation, his symptoms began to improve significantly. "You probably saved my life," David told Sarah after receiving his diagnosis. "I was starting to think I was going crazy. Having someone who understood what I was going through made all the difference." These experiences reinforced Sarah's growing conviction that her personal medical ordeal had prepared her for a larger purpose. She began considering whether to pursue additional education that would allow her to specialize in veteran health care or advocate for policy changes that would improve medical care for military personnel. By the 1-year anniversary of her surgery, Sarah had not only returned to full capacity as a trauma nurse, but had become a respected advocate and educator within the veteran community. Her experience with undiagnosed combat injury had transformed from a source of pain and frustration into a powerful tool for helping others. The piece of shrapnel that Dr. Rodriguez had removed from her body now sat in a small frame on Sarah's desk at home, alongside her military medals and commendations. It served as a reminder of her service, her struggle for recognition and treatment, and her ultimate triumph over the doubt and skepticism she had faced. Janet Williams had asked Sarah to speak at a hospital-wide conference about patient advocacy and the importance of taking unexplained symptoms seriously. Standing before her colleagues in the same auditorium where she had once felt isolated and questioned, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her circumstances had changed. "A year ago, I was sitting in many of your positions, looking at a colleague with unexplained symptoms and wondering whether those symptoms were real," Sarah told the audience. "I understand the skepticism, the desire for clear diagnostic categories, and the frustration when patients present with problems we can't immediately solve. But I also understand what it feels like to be the patient whose suffering is questioned, whose credibility is doubted, and whose symptoms are dismissed as psychological when they're actually physical. My experience taught me that our first obligation as healthcare providers is to believe our patients and advocate for them, even when we don't have immediate answers." The presentation was well received, and several colleagues approached Sarah afterward to thank her for sharing her story. More importantly, the hospital administration announced new policies aimed at better supporting both patients and employees dealing with unexplained medical symptoms. As Sarah looked toward the future, she felt grateful for the difficult journey that had brought her to this point. The months of pain, doubt, and struggle had been challenging, but they had also revealed strengths and purposes she might never have discovered otherwise. Her experience had taught her the importance of persistence, self-advocacy, and maintaining faith in her own judgment even when others questioned it. These lessons served her well not only in her own life, but in her growing role as an advocate for other veterans facing similar challenges. The battle wound that had hidden beneath her coat for so long had indeed spoken louder than words, not just about her physical condition, but about her character, her resilience, and her commitment to helping others. What had begun as a source of pain and isolation had ultimately become a source of purpose and connection. Sarah Martinez had won more than just a medical victory. She had reclaimed her professional reputation, found her voice as an advocate, and discovered a new mission that combined her military service, medical expertise, and personal experience in ways that made a real difference in other people's lives. The mocking and doubt she had endured had been replaced by respect and recognition, not because she had proven others wrong, but because she had proven herself right. Her body had carried the evidence of her service and sacrifice all along. It had just taken time, persistence, and the right medical expertise to reveal the truth that had been there from the beginning.